On Friday, MSNBC host Chris Hayes made a widely mocked argument about the Electoral College, the undemocratic method by which we select our president that's very fashionable to malign.
The weirdest thing about the Electoral College is the fact that if it wasn't specifically in the Constitution for the presidency, it would be unconstitutional.
Okay, but being in the Constitution is what makes something constitutional. Make all the jokes you want. Were it not for being idiotic, this argument would be smart. It's poorly phrased, no doubt. But when I first saw the headlines and the tweets, I suspected there was probably some more meat to his argument. And when I checked it out in context, there surely is. In fact, his 10-minute explainer on why we should abolish the Electoral College and run the presidential election the way we run every other election, he says, more on that later, is actually very well received, a hugely positive response on YouTube as of this recording, with upvoted comments praising it as beneficial viewing for all Americans, and one of the best arguments on why we need to change the system. There is an actual argument here, and when you think about it, you can gather what Chris means when he says that were it not in the Constitution, the Electoral College would be unconstitutional. What he means is that it seems at odds with the rest of the document, a general violation of the principles and the philosophy on which the Constitution is based. I disagree, and I'll argue for philosophically sound reasons, but what bugs me the most about Chris's argument is he just labels every one of my perspective wrong.
There are all kinds of people who will tell you this is good for all sorts of reasons, and they are all wrong.
Without giving any serious consideration to the best of our arguments. He says we only appreciate the Electoral College because it's a system that lets us win.
It is not surprising that Republicans are defending the Electoral College. There's a very obvious reason for that. Since 1992, we have had 7 presidential elections. Republicans have won the popular vote 1 time, but they've gotten 3 presidents out of it. You can see why, on just basic tactical grounds, why the Republican Party would want to continue a system in which they can lose a majority of votes and still get all the powers of the presidency.
Okay, so dump on my perspective without even seriously considering its strongest case. Were it not for being specifically weak, this argument would be a strong one. But Chris is right about one thing. This issue rests on a fundamental question about what this country is, structurally and organizationally. Are we just one big giant democracy where the majority exerts its will through a powerful centralized government, as he asks?
And this, I think, actually has become a major fault line. In fact, one of the most profound fault lines in the history of American politics. Do we actually really believe in democracy?
Or are we 50 smaller, mostly autonomous places under one limited collective defense? Does the word states in United States of America actually mean something? Or are we just the 330 million united people of America? And if 170 million of us decide something, the rest of us have to shut up and get in line? To me, it's clear how this country's founders and constitutional framers would have answered that question. And when you think about that original intent and that design philosophy, the Electoral College starts to make a lot more sense. The philosophical basis that Chris ignores is this: states matter. That fundamentally, we are a collection of states under a constitutionally limited federal government that should serve a minimal role of collective defense and peacekeeping between the states. But generally, all aspects of your day-to-day life should be handled within your state. In that structure, neither the president nor the federal government really do all that much affecting you personally. They simply mediate between the states and defend the states and operate on behalf of the states and represent the states. And so it makes sense that the states would select the president. And by the way, that is a system I will happily defend, regardless of whether my guy gets in or not, both because I believe that states matter and the president is a representative of the states, but also because under that system, the president doesn't really matter that much. He doesn't really affect me. If I don't like certain aspects of my life here in Montana, I can go to the Capitol in Helena, which is much easier and much more accessible than centralized power in Washington, D.C. And so if you assume that structure is intended, and actually you don't have to assume, it is explicitly intended, given the hours of deliberation in crafting the Constitution and the Federalist Papers explicitly explaining the reasoning, if you recognize that states are important in decentralizing power and preserving liberty, the rest of Chris's argument starts to fall apart. He says that the Electoral College is at odds with the constitutional principle of one person, one vote.
Starting in the 1960s, 1961 particularly, the Supreme Court started developing a jurisprudence of one person, one vote. The idea is that each individual vote has to carry roughly the same amount of weight as each other individual vote, which is a pretty intuitive concept, but it was not a reality.
First of all, that is an inferred principle that the courts have applied to the Constitution, not an explicit constitutional clause. Chris is arguing that inference ought to outweigh the actual text of the document. And besides, the president isn't unique in this election and representation system. As Chris notes, this is the exact same system for the U.S. Senate.
You may have noticed the same number of senators represent the 40 million people of California and the 500,000 people of Wyoming. Not really one person, one vote-y.
And remember, at the time of the founding, state legislators selected their senators, not direct popular vote. So is that some unconstitutional accident? Did the framers just forget that they actually supported direct democracy at the federal level? Or were they following that basic principle that states matter and that states should be represented before the federal government? Chris says the founders created the Electoral College because they were elitist, because they thought the common man was far too stupid to select the president.
The real genesis of the Electoral College was the belief shared by a lot of the founders that ordinary people were dumb and couldn't be trusted to elect a president. So instead, people would elect electors who would in turn convene and pick like a wise man. Alexander Hamilton, among others, did not want normal people choosing the president. He was very clear about this. They wanted a, quote, small number of persons to do it.
That is a deliberate misreading of Fed 68, which Hamilton wrote to explain the rationale for the system. Hamilton didn't write arguing for a small number of persons to select the president. He wrote a small number of persons selected by their fellow citizens in their states, chosen in each state, assembled in each state, that these electors ought to be equal to the total representation of that state in the federal government, their votes to be delivered on behalf of that state to the federal government. Hamilton didn't write this language because he thinks you're stupid, like Chris says. He wrote this language because he thought states matter and that states should select the president. Chris says the system allows actual land to vote.
Here's the weirdest part. It is true that in the United States Constitution, thanks to the Senate and the Electoral College, land gets to vote. Like the actual soil of Wyoming, the acreage of South Dakota, the square plots of the vast expanse of Utah, they get votes. Because they are land.
No, they get votes because they are states. Again, because states matter in the organization of this country. Alaska doesn't get 2 senators because of its gigantic landmass. It gets 2 senators just like tiny Rhode Island because they are both states, equal in that status before the federal government. As the video title states, Chris says we need to run the presidential election just like we run every other election.
And if one person, one vote means anything at all, it's time to do something totally radical. And that is this: run the presidential election the way we run every other election. The person with the most votes wins.
We do run the presidential election just like we run every other election. You vote in your state. There is no election in which you vote nationally, not one, because voting, just like every other aspect of your day-to-day life, is supposed to be the domain of your state, not the domain of gigantic top-down control in Washington. Toward that end, Chris actually gets it right for a moment about the consequences of majoritarian rule, though I think for the wrong reasons, but the glimpse is there. He says conservatives only oppose simple majority rule because they fear that they're a minority.
It's about the fact that one of the major political coalitions in American life doesn't want Americans, a majority of them, to run the country, because they fear, they know, they suspect deep down that they are in the minority.
Yeah, exactly. I do fear that I'm in a minority on any number of issues, and I don't think my life should be strictly controlled from thousands of miles away because of it. In a place run by simple majority rule, the minority is not a fun thing to be. I think any person would be wise to have that fear, just as I presume that Chris doesn't want his life dictated from Mississippi. 51% of people over there don't negate my rights over here. And that's exactly the point that Dan Crenshaw made, for which Chris implicitly calls him a hypocrite.
Back to Dan Crenshaw, who says that the nature of American constitutional government is, because we are a republic, not a democracy, the 51% can't boss around the 49%. But what he and his party are advocating is a world in which the 49% boss around the 51%.
No. That is a fundamental misunderstanding. An argument against tyranny of the majority is not an argument for tyranny of the minority. It's just an argument against tyranny. Chris presumes, well, there's a whole lot of bossing to be done around here. It's just a question of who gets to do it. How about we just do less bossing? No matter what percent you hold. The 49% have no desire to boss you around. I assure you, I have no desire to boss around California. We just want to be left alone in our states, as we have the right to be. If I were able to talk to Chris, I suspect we'd just arrive at a fundamental disagreement about whether states or people should be prioritized in our system of representation. And that's fine. But I bet we actually agree on a common desire not to be controlled by some idiot in Washington, especially if that idiot occupies the most powerful office there is.
Just ponder how preposterous it is that for the most powerful office, that's the case. If you run for class president in the 4th grade, you are elected if and only if you get the most votes.
Well, there are two ways to deal with that problem. One is to reform how we decide who gets to wield this almighty sword. The other is to stop creating these almighty swords in the first place. Despite our philosophical disagreements, I wish Chris and I could agree that if we just restored the federal government and the presidency to their properly limited constitutional roles, who sits in the Oval Office and how he got there are questions we wouldn't have to fight over very much, because he doesn't do much to affect our lives. We would have more individual control to live our lives as we see fit, in states that are suited to our preferences. But instead of let's destroy the sword, the argument will forever be, no, give me the sword. I know how to wield it correctly. Yeah, good luck with that. Why don't you do it in California or New York first, and then maybe I'll believe you. But ironically, that's really the whole point, isn't it? Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel always. Appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below, and especially over on Twitter, that is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to coming out and chat in my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it. Goodbye.